Russia publicly acknowledged its economy is slowing, but what that slowdown actually looks like from the inside and what it means for the country's ability to keep fighting a war it cannot quickly win is a far more serious story than any press conference admission suggests. In December 2025, Vladimir Putin used his annual public address to concede, in carefully managed language, that Russia's economy was losing momentum. He didn't call it a crisis. He didn't use the word recession. He said it was slowing, then moved on. But the data behind that admission and the statements that followed from Russia's own senior officials paint a picture that the Kremlin's language is designed to obscure. On April 16, 2026, Russia's central bank governor Elvira Nabiullina appeared at the Moscow Exchange for a man event attended by senior policymakers, market professionals, and government figures and delivered a statement that was, by the standards of Russian officialdom, strikingly candid. Russia, she said, is facing a labor shortage unlike anything in its modern history. Unemployment has dropped to 2%. That number sounds like economic health. It is not. It is the statistical byproduct of a war that has pulled hundreds of thousands of working-age men out of the civilian economy through military mobilization and through emigration on a scale Russian labor markets have never before had to absorb. When the workforce shrinks and employers compete for the workers who remain, wages go up. When wages rise without a corresponding increase in what those workers can actually produce, prices rise with them. And when prices rise faster than incomes tied to official inflation metrics, the incomes of teachers, doctors, pensioners, law enforcement workers, the people who form the core of Putin's domestic political base, purchasing power falls. The social contract that has held Russia together through 4 years of war begins to erode. Quietly, gradually, in ways that don't show up immediately in any single data point but accumulate into something that authoritarian governments historically struggle to manage. Nabiullina didn't stop at the labor shortage. She described Russia's economy as overheated, driving inflation and complicating the central bank's ability to set interest rates. She warned of what she called a persistent downturn in external conditions affecting both Russian exports and imports, and she connected Russia's internal crisis to a global one. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil normally moves, is adding inflationary pressure to a Russian economy that was already struggling under the weight of its own war. The Iran crisis is not a distant event for Moscow. It is landing inside Russia's economic statistics as a variable that central bank models had not fully accounted for. These are not the words of an official managing a temporary disruption. They are the words of an official describing a structural transformation set in motion the moment Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, a transformation now producing consequences that neither fiscal policy nor interest rate adjustments can easily undo. To understand where Russia is today, you have to understand why its recent economic numbers looked better than many Western analysts expected, and why they no longer do. In 2023 and 2024, Russia's GDP grew by more than 4% in both years. That surprised observers who had anticipated that the scale of Western sanctions imposed after the invasion would produce rapid, visible economic contraction. It didn't. But the growth that appeared in those years was not organic. It was not driven by innovation, by expanding export markets, or by a flourishing private sector. It was the product of wartime fiscal stimulus on a scale Russia hadn't attempted since the Soviet era. The government dramatically increased defense contracts, military wages, payments to soldiers' families, and procurement across the entire defense industrial base. That spending entered the economy as demand. GDP rose because the state was paying for a war at extraordinary scale, and those payments registered in the statistics. But wartime spending creates a fundamentally different kind of economy than peacetime growth. Every ruble directed toward producing artillery shells, armored vehicles, and military equipment is a ruble withheld from hospitals, roads, factory upgrades, and technology investment. The military-industrial sector grew its output by 20% in the first half of 2025. Every other manufacturing sector combined grew by just 0.4%. Russia was constructing a two-track economy, one track thriving on state war contracts, the other gradually being starved of investment, credit, and the imported technology that Western sanctions had systematically cut off. The Bank of Finland's Institute for Emerging Economies, known as BOFIT, described this dynamic precisely in its March 2026 forecast. Military-industrial investment, it concluded, was unlikely to raise future growth potential because large quantities of investment goods being produced by the economy were being consumed at the front rather than building productive capacity. Russia, in plain terms, is consuming its own economic future to fund a present war. The fiscal numbers that have emerged since early 2026 make that abstract observation concrete and alarming. In the first quarter of 2026, Putin ordered senior economic officials to explain why the economy was underperforming. The answer was not difficult to locate. Russia's economy contracted by 1.8% in the first 2 months of 2026, the first contraction since the initial shock of the invasion itself for years. Earlier, oil tax revenue in March dropped by half compared to the same month the previous year. The federal budget deficit widened to $58.6 billion in the first quarter alone. Russia's national wealth fund, the sovereign reserve vehicle that serves as the country's emergency fiscal cushion, has declined from roughly $185 billion in 2021 to just $35.7 billion today. In 4 years of war, Russia has spent down more than 80% of that buffer. The liquid assets remaining are now smaller than the projected deficit for a single year. Analysts at Euromaidan Press, working from Russian Finance Ministry data, calculated in late 2025 that Moscow may have as little as 12 to 18 months before it faces a binary choice: reduce military spending or confront fiscal collapse. The interest rate environment compounding all of this is almost uniquely punishing. Russia's central bank held its benchmark rate at a record 21% through much of 2025, maintained there by Nabiullina's insistence that an overheated economy needed cooling against enormous pressure from industrialists and politicians demanding cheaper credit to sustain expansion. That 21% rate was not merely contractionary. It was systematically destroying the financial viability of private businesses not connected to the defense sector. Companies relying on borrowed capital discovered that debt at 21% interest was not a financing mechanism. It was a trap. Investment collapsed. The indirect investment index fell 9% from October 2024 and 11.5% from its peak in summer 2023, effectively returning to levels last seen in early 2019, erasing years of capital formation in a matter of months. Businesses across the civilian economy were going unpaid, furloughing staff, cutting hours. The companies surviving were the ones with government contracts. The ones without them were quietly failing. The VAT increase from 20% to 22% that took effect on January 1, 2026, the first such increase in Russia's modern history, implemented explicitly to fund military needs, added another layer of pressure on ordinary Russians and civilian enterprises at precisely the moment when the non-military economy could least absorb additional cost. Carnegie Endowment analysts noted that the greatest losers in Russia's overheated economy are the people who form the bedrock of Putin's domestic support: public sector workers, including teachers, doctors, and law enforcement personnel, along with pensioners, whose wages and benefits are indexed to official inflation running at around 9%, while real household inflation for many families exceeds 20%. The gap between official figures and lived experience is exactly the kind of economic friction that, over time, erodes the political acquiescence that authoritarian governments depend upon to function without visible opposition. The defense spending trajectory tells its own story about where Russia's fiscal priorities are now fixed. Defense and security spending will exceed 8% of GDP in 2026, a level not seen since the Soviet Union's Cold War peak, and will account for approximately 40% of total federal expenditure. Healthcare, education, and housing combined receive just 13% of the budget. Carnegie Endowment analysts describe the consequence directly. Non-defense budgetary allocations are stagnating or shrinking in real terms. Social services, national economic programs, and even internal security and law enforcement face funding cuts. Chronic underfunding and personnel shortages in Russia's Interior Ministry and Federal Penitentiary Service are worsening. Russia has moved its entire economy onto wartime rails, and the budget signed into law by Putin in November 2025 is not a signal of readiness for peace. It is the formal consolidation of a wartime economic structure designed to endure regardless of cost. International sanctions have been a primary driver of this deterioration, even if their full depth took years to become clearly visible. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion in February 2022, Western governments and their allies moved with unusual speed and coordination to impose sweeping economic penalties. The Atlantic Council's Russia sanctions database has tracked losses of tens of billions of dollars directly attributable to those measures. Hundreds of oligarchs, politicians, business owners, and companies have been individually sanctioned, assets frozen or seized, international financial transactions cut off. More than 1,000 international companies, documented by Yale University researchers, have suspended or permanently ended their operations in Russia, removing not just capital but technology, management expertise, and access to global supply chains that the Russian economy cannot easily replace from domestic production or Chinese alternatives. The technological aging of Russia's capital goods is accelerating, as Buffett noted, precisely because sanctions have blocked access to the newest generation of industrial machinery and components. The productivity gains that might otherwise offset the labor shortage require technology investments that sanctions are making progressively more difficult to execute. The oil revenue picture, the single most important variable in Russia's fiscal arithmetic, has deteriorated in ways the Kremlin's 2026 budget had not fully anticipated when it was drafted. Oil and gas earnings fell 34% year-on-year in November 2025. December receipts dropped to approximately $5.1 billion, the lowest level since the pandemic. Russia's Urals crude, the benchmark for its export sales, has been trading at a discount of nearly $30 per barrel compared to international benchmarks as tightening sanctions squeeze the mechanisms Russia uses to move its oil: the shadow fleet of tankers operating under false flags, the price cap enforcement mechanisms, the insurance restrictions. Russia's 2026 budget was built on optimistic oil price assumptions that the market has already invalidated. The Iran crisis created a temporary spike in global crude prices that Russia benefits from to the extent it can still export, but the discount on Urals crude has eaten into that benefit, and the Strait of Hormuz situation adds supply chain complications to Russia's own import and export logistics on top of everything else. Against this economic backdrop, Russia's civil society and political landscape have undergone a transformation that makes the economic crisis both harder to publicly acknowledge and more dangerous in its long-term implications. Human Rights Watch's World Report 2026, published in February, documented what it described as an escalating crackdown on dissent that has systematically closed every legal avenue through which Russians might express opposition to the war or its economic consequences. Authorities expanded censorship and surveillance, increasingly deployed charges of undermining state security, and streamlined prosecutions of critics designated as foreign agents. In the first half of 2025 alone, courts launched 72 criminal cases for alleged non-compliance with foreign agent legislation, 78. Organizations were banned as undesirable, including prominent human rights groups. Human Rights Watch itself was designated undesirable in November. A leading Russian election monitoring activist, Gregory Melkonians, received a 5-year prison sentence for supposed involvement with an undesirable organization. The independent human rights monitoring organization OVD Info documented that since the laws criminalizing criticism of the military were introduced in March 2022, large-scale anti-war protest has effectively ceased. The last significant mass demonstrations occurred in September 2022 when protests against mobilization broke out across multiple regions. Since then, Russians who oppose the war have been reduced to solitary acts of visible dissent, individuals standing alone in public spaces with signs, risking arrest, prosecution, and imprisonment. The mechanisms of repression have been refined to the point where criminal cases are now being initiated over social media posts published years before the prosecution begins, a deliberate strategy of retrospective enforcement designed to ensure that every Russian citizen understands that anything they have ever written or said online could be used against them at any moment the state chooses to act. The political challenges extend beyond managing internal dissent. They reach into the elite factions within Russia's own power structure, where the war has created winners and losers in ways that have not fully stabilized. The June 2023 Wagner Group rebellion, when Yevgeny Prigozhin's mercenary force seized Rostov-on-Don and drove armored columns to within a few hundred kilometers of Moscow before standing down, was the most significant direct challenge to Putin's authority in his 23 years in power. It was suppressed, and Prigozhin died in a plane crash 2 months later. But the episode left marks on the Kremlin's image of invulnerability that have not entirely healed. It demonstrated that Putin's authority, while intact, rested on a more complex and contested foundation than the strongman image projected outward to the world. Elite figures who had been quiet about the war's management became briefly visible. Factions with differing views on strategy, military leadership, and the distribution of war profits were exposed. The Council on Foreign Relations noted at the time that even a failed insurrection offered future challengers a clearer map of what was possible and what was not. The political pressure from elite discontent has taken more subtle form since Prigozhin's death. The replacement of Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, whom Prigozhin had publicly excoriated as incompetent and corrupt with Andrei Belousov, an economist, in 2024, was widely read as an acknowledgement that the war's financial management had become as critical as its military management. The signal was clear. The Kremlin was beginning to worry about whether the war could be sustained economically as much as whether it could be won militarily. Belousov's appointment was the institutional expression of that concern, a recognition that the defense ministry needed to think not only about battlefield outcomes, but about keeping the financial architecture of the war effort from collapsing under its own accumulated weight. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund have both forecast Russian GDP growth of around 1% for 2026, consistent with the 0.9% the World Bank recorded for 2025, and a dramatic fall from the 4+ growth of the 2 preceding years. Buffett's March 2026 forecast projected growth decelerating further still to around 0.5% for both 2027 and 2028. The Finnish institution's language was unambiguous. Sustained economic growth appears unlikely. A 2-track economic structure is consolidating, firms serving the war effort thriving, while those outside the military-industrial complex face conditions described as heading toward a point of no return in terms of capital investment, technological access, and financial viability. Putin knows this. His April 2026 order demanding that government officials and the central bank explain the economy's underperformance was an act of political management, a way of establishing on the record that the president is pressing for answers, while buying time before those answers produce consequences visible enough to require a genuine response. What he has not done is change the fundamental equation. Defense and security consume 40% of the federal budget. The war in Ukraine continues. Sanctions remain in place. The labor shortage deepens. The currency fluctuates. The national wealth fund drains. And Nabiullina stands before assembled finance ministers and market experts and describes a persistent downturn in external conditions affecting both exports and imports. Careful language for a country that is running out of fiscal room to absorb the cost of a war it cannot win quickly and cannot afford to sustain indefinitely. The international companies that left will not return while the war continues. The sanctioned assets will not unfreeze. The educated professionals who emigrated after the 2022 mobilization, hundreds of thousands of them have not come back and show no signs of doing so. The military-industrial output that grew 20% while everything else flatlined is now projected to grow just 5% to 7% as the initial surge of war-driven procurement. Moderates, the civilian economy has no equivalent engine of growth waiting to replace it. The question that no Russian official and no Western analyst can answer with certainty is, how long? How long can a nuclear-armed, energy-producing, surveillance-capable authoritarian state with deep nationalist sentiment in its population continue absorbing economic attrition at this pace before something gives the fiscal position, elite cohesion, civilian tolerance for declining living standards, or the military's capacity to recruit, equip, and sustain? The honest answer, as documented by every credible institution that has studied it, is that the runway is shorter than it was, and it is getting shorter. The margin for error is smaller. The tools available to extend it are fewer. What Russia retains and what no sanctions regime can eliminate is time, and a political system with extraordinary tools to suppress the internal voices that would otherwise demand a reckoning. What it is losing, year by year, dollar by dollar, worker by worker, is everything else.